All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the October NetBox community call. Thanks for joining me today. As always, my name is Jeremy Stretch. I'm the founder and lead maintainer of the NetBox open source project. Normally, I'll have someone else with me on these calls, usually Jordan Villarreal. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it today, so I'll be flying solo for this month's call. Got a few interesting things to go over, though. First off, a quick shout out to DigitalOcean for renewing their sponsorship. I'm going to highlight the new NetBox Zero to Hero course put together by Rich Bibby at NS1. And we'll dive into a preview of some of the features coming up in NetBox version 3.4. And then, as always, wrap up with some Q&A from the community. So I've got a couple of pre-submitted questions, but as always, if you have any questions in the chat, feel free to pop them in, and I'll take them live as we can get to them. So first off, as I mentioned, thank you to DigitalOcean. So they recently opted to renew their sponsorship of the NetBox project, and that comes in the form of credit allotments for running our public demo instances. So those are demo.netbox.dev, and then during a beta period, we have a second demo where we run the a beta instance for people to test as well. So those are both obviously very, very useful for the community. So big thanks to DigitalOcean. And for anyone who doesn't know, NetBox got its start at DigitalOcean. So we've always had a rather special relationship with them. I founded NetBox when I was working as a network engineer at DO back in 2015. And then they agreed to approve and support the open source release of it later in 2016. So without their support, NetBox wouldn't be around today. So thank you. Next up, new training content. So it's called the Zero to Hero course. You can reach it at zerotohero.netbox.dev. This is a collection of free training content put together primarily by Rich Bibby on the NS1, the NetBox team at NS1. This essentially picks up where the installation guide leaves off. So obviously, if you're following the installation guide and the official documentation, you'll see how to get NetBox up and running, and then it's kind of like, there you go. A lot of people are new to the application and are kind of left wondering, well, what next, right? That's exactly where this guide picks up. So assuming you've got a functioning empty NetBox deployment, how do you go about populating data and all that stuff, and calls out some features and kind of works as a functional tour using a real world scenario as a guide. So it's module based. It's got 7 of the 12 planned modules have been completed so far. Each module is accompanied by a video. And just walks through the initial deployment and goes from there and just follows some real world examples. Here's a quick rundown of the modules that are both completed and planned. So you can see we go from the introduction to, all right, how do I plan out my organization as far as like sites and racks and tenants and all that, adding gear, right, device types and populating devices and racks, addressing in VLANs, and then making connections via cables, wireless, and so forth. Then it gets into some of the more advanced things like automation, virtualization, and eventually customizing and writing reports and all that good stuff. So that's still, like I mentioned, actively under development, but check it out now. It's free. There's no registration or anything like that. You can just dive in and let us know also. So in the previous slide, there is a link to the GitHub. So this is the course itself is open source as well. Feel free to drop in an issue or comment if there's something in particular you'd like to see, or if you'd like, if you have any feedback on how it could be improved, let us know. Hopefully that'll wrap up here. We'll get the remaining 5 modules probably in the next 4 to 6 weeks or so. So keep an eye on that. Okay, moving on. So obviously we've got NetBox version 3.4 coming up soon. So I wanted to take the opportunity to go over some of the most impactful new features that will be included in this release. So first and foremost, we have, yes, a new global search engine. I know this has been a pain point for NetBox users for quite a while, but we have completely ripped out the legacy search and replaced it with a new proper cache-based indexed search functionality. So the legacy search engine up to and including NetBox version 3.3 frankly isn't really a search engine. It's basically a view that just runs a bunch of queries on a bunch of different object types and tries to do a partial match on whatever string you provide. It works kind of for, the bare minimum of what you might consider from a search function, but obviously it's not ideal. It has a number of shortcomings. One being performance, the second, another being lack of, or rather narrow scope in what objects it's actually looking for. And I believe we resolved all of those with the new implementation. So the new one is actually a proper, builds a proper search cache, runs a single query for any search, supports various lookup types. So you can do a partial or exact match, or starts with, ends with, and it's matching against particular field values. And these are weighted, which I'll talk about in a second. But performance has been greatly improved. I can tell you anecdotally, a data set that generated about 1.1 million cache entries. Queries were happening in 140 milliseconds, and that's locally on my machine with debugging enabled and everything. So already leaps and bounds ahead of what's there today. We've also added custom field support. So that was actually, I think there's actually a separate feature request for that I didn't call out specifically on the slide, but that has been enabled as well. So if you define a custom field on a site or a device or what have you, it will match those as well. So if you create a custom field and then custom field named foo on the site model, and then you go create a site and you populate that value is getting cached into the search index. And as soon as you create that site, you can then search and match on that value. So that'll be a boon for quite a number of folks who rely heavily on custom fields. And additionally, as part of the work on the plugins API that I'll get to in a minute, plugins can now register their own models for search as well. So if you've got, for example, a plugin that models BGP, you'll be able to, in NetBox 3.4 and later, define a very lightweight index for it that specifies what fields to index and the weight to be attributed to each. And then those will pop up in the search cache as well. So you can search, and any of the global search will return results from plugin models as well. So I mentioned precedents there very briefly. So here's an example of showing just how the search is working now. You can see at the top, you've got your generic field for search. You can select multiple objects types or just leave it blank to search everything. And then you can specify a lookup logic. So right now we're supporting partial match, exact match, meaning the entire field value, or starts with or ends with. And we'll add additional things as we go. That part will probably be something that we continue to develop over time as we figure out, okay, how do we want to consume this new search endpoint? Do we want to develop kind of a domain specific language for search? That gets kind of hairy, but the good news is that ultimately we're just querying a database, and all that's pretty straightforward. We just have to figure out how we best want to do that and convey it to the user. But you'll see here I've searched for the string Akron, and I've returned several different object types all in the same table. And specifically, I'm returning each field on which I'm matching those. So each field within a model has a weight attributed to it. So, and these are administratively defined. So typically you'll say that a name has a higher precedence than something like a description, and a serial number might have a higher precedence than a name, right? Because those are highly unique. So if I happen to match this random string, it's as a serial number, that's probably exactly what I want, right? Where a name is a higher degree of that. Just falling over my words here. Where it's likely that a name is going to be what you want to match as well. It's not as likely finding something like a string inside a description or even a comments field. So you'll see these are ordered by precedence of field, and then you see the value for each field that's being matched, and that's being highlighted in there. So it's all pretty straightforward, and hopefully functions as you'd expect. We'll continue to refine this as we go, but I think that what we have right now already is a pretty strong solution. Another one that we're working on for 3.4 is saved filters. So if you go right now to filter objects in NetBox, say you want to find something reasonably complex, like perhaps I want to find all devices within a specific site that has one or two certain statuses and has a tag applied to it, or maybe some other condition. You can do all that right now by going through and defining the filters and applying it, and you should see exactly what you want to see. Problem is, if you want to repeat that again tomorrow, you have to go through the whole process again. You can always bookmark the URL, but that isn't the most friendly way to accomplish that. So the idea behind this feature request number 9623 is to be able to save any applied filter. So if I go through and I create a filter, I just click save and I give it a name, and then I can use it and I can share it with other NetBox users to use it as well. And I can apply that directly from within the UI. The query gets stored, so any applied filters get stored as JSON in the database and just retrieved whenever we're matching that by the name of the filter. That way we don't have to go through and reapply those filters by hand every time. We can just select one of the predefined filters. This isn't a screenshot. This is actually just kind of this was actually pulled out of the feature request just to give you a better idea of how it should work, because the work hasn't been completed on this yet. But essentially, once you've applied some filters, you have the option of creating a saved filter from that, and then you can modify that or apply those in the future. There's a question from the chat from Patrick. Can we add these predefined filters as tabs/buttons to the screens so we can easily access them? That's a good question. I don't know that we've gotten that far with it yet. In fact, we haven't really started much of the work here. I've got it modeled up, but I haven't actually implemented it yet. That said, I hope to get this done by next week. Possibly, that's a bit of feedback that we can definitely act on during the beta period. So once we come out with it, try it out and see if that's something that seems like it'll make sense. Off the top of my head, I could say at a very minimum, you could probably add like a custom link that would link to the filter, but that's a good question. And that's what's kind of fun about things like this is we have the base functionality, and then when we go to implement it, we'll find questions like that where people say, oh, can I use it this way? Can I use it that way? And that's how features grow over time and mature. So potentially, yeah. Next up is CSV-based bulk update. So this is something that's been around for a while. I know a lot of people have been asking for it. Currently in NetBox, for most object types, you can import new objects in bulk from a CSV data source. So typically you start with like a spreadsheet from Excel or Google Sheets and export that to CSV data and then populate that, basically upload that to NetBox, and every row creates a new object. That works well. Unfortunately, up to now, it's only been able to support the creation of new objects. FR 7961 facilitates the ability to update existing objects from spreadsheet values. So typically you'll have a primary key that identifies a unique object in NetBox. We rely on a key because that's guaranteed to be unique, whereas other fields are not. And then any number of fields that you want to update for individual objects. So for example, say I'm updating 3 sites. I get their primary keys from the database, and then I want to set their descriptions. So I set a description value. Then I hit submit, and it's going to update those objects in place in the database. I can specify whatever columns I want, representing individual object fields. Now, all this normal rules will apply, right? If the maximum value for a field is 100, I can't set 101. That's still going to validate all that. But what's nice is that I don't have any required fields anymore. So all these objects already exist. I don't have to do anything to them. I can change just the description or just the status or what have you. That said, any columns that are listed is going to take the value out of that and apply it to the object in the database. So hopefully this will provide a path for folks who want to do bulk updates, but using discrete or unique values for each field, right? We have the bulk update functionality in NetBox as well, where you can select however many objects you want, submit and you'll get a bulk update form. But the limitation of that approach is that every field that you fill out it's going to be the same value for every object, right? So that's great if you want to change 100 sites all to the same status or all to the same description. But if you want to use a different description for each, this will finally accommodate that workflow. Next up, we have a collection of improvements to the GraphQL API. First, I want to call out FR number 10472. So there's a bit of a story behind this. If you're not aware, the NetBox GraphQL API is powered by a library called Graphene Django, which uses graphene as you'd expect. That project had gone stale for a while. It last released version 2.15 in, I think it was December of 2020. And there hadn't been any updates for some time. And one of the maintainers had a comment on one of the GitHub issues there asking for a new update to support Django 4.0, I think it was, basically saying no further work was going to be done on the project. Well, that was disappointing. And we started evaluating potential replacements. We kind of focused on a library called Strawberry as a potential replacement GraphQL API. But fortunately, the project was picked back up and had its 3.0 release, went through a number of betas and had its final 3.0 release in September. So that is now up and running again, and we've adapted to use that. And that has kind of unblocked us from all this additional GraphQL work. So we can finally get to have some progress made on those. So we've implemented, I don't know what the proper term would be, but basically filtering it all at deeper levels against different objects. So you can filter on related objects, not just the root level. That's under FR 8245. It's better. It's easier now to follow relationships across like cables. So link peers specifically now you can follow those. Generic foreign keys, same thing. Support just kind of in general has been improved in a lot of different ways, as well as the documentation. So if you're a big GraphQL API user, please check out the beta. Let us know what you think. Does it work like you expected? Is there something missing? The beta period is that kind of feedback is crucial during the beta period, because during the beta we have carte blanche to change anything we want to change. Once we hit that 3.4.0 release, the final release, and the API gets locked in, it's a lot more difficult for us to make changes, especially breaking changes. Because anything breaking then has to wait for 3.5, which won't be out until April next year. So again, if you're a GraphQL whole API user, test early, test often, and let us know what you think. And we'll have the public demo will be out too, in conjunction with the beta release, which should be in a couple weeks. Another API is the plugins API. So a ton of enhancements to this as well. Following on kind of what we did in 3.2, we had a bunch of improvements to the plugins API. Not so much in 3.3, a bunch more now in 3.4. It does kind of feel like we've fallen into this sort of tick-tock pattern, kind of like what Intel does with their chips, where we'll focus kind of like more on the data model stuff on one release, and then we'll switch back to core on the next release. I don't know if we'll keep doing that, but it does seem like we've kind of fallen into that pattern naturally. So first off, as I mentioned, we have search integration now. So if your plugin introduces its own models, you can register them, write a very, very simple index. It basically just says what fields you want to index and the weight for each of them. And then that will start showing up in global search results. Top level navigation menu items. So your plugin can now, up till the current release of NetBox, plugins have been able to introduce menu items within the plugin's kind of top level menu. That's still an option. If you're doing that today, that'll still work in NetBox 3.4. But now you also have the option of introducing your own root level menu. So this really depends on what kind of plugin you have. If it's a very minimal plugin, maybe it only has like 1 or 2 views, stick with the current way because you probably don't want your own menu. But if it's a bigger plugin, like I know there's some out there like NetBox BGP, NetBox DNS, those obviously have more advanced data models and more views. They would benefit from having their own root level navigation menu. So you can do that now as well. In fact, you can even mix and match. You can do both if you want, although most people probably won't. On that topic, we've also introduced the ability for plugins to register tabs under core views. So for example, if you go to look at a device in NetBox, you'll see the device tab with all the attributes of the device. And then you'll see interfaces and console ports and power outlets and stuff like that. And then journaling and changelog as you do with some other objects. Well, with NetBox 3.4, now plugins can register their own tabs, which kind of embed their own content within the context of a core object. This actually triggered a lot of refactoring internally within NetBox to get rid of a lot of cruft that had been blocking this kind of work. So currently in 3.3 and earlier, the generation of tabs within those object views has all been hard-coded into the templates in a very kind of not fun way. But unfortunately, we've gotten rid of a lot of that. It's all dynamic now, so plugins can very easily integrate and inject their own tabs. So you'll have a tab, my plugin tab, whatever, under the device view or site view or whatever kind of object you want to embed. Another point under the plugins API is the ability now to install and register additional Django apps. So plugins obviously have always had the ability to bring in their own dependencies as far as other Python packages, but not to install additional Django apps. So if you're not familiar, the way Django works is essentially under settings, you have a setting called installed apps. And this is just a list of everything that exists in your application as far as Django apps. So for NetBox, we have things like the DSIM app, the circuits app, the IPAM app, etc. And then plugins become apps as well. This allows plugins to then also specify additional apps to be loaded before or after the plugin itself. So there's a little bit of nuance around this. For most people, If you do need to pull in a Django app, it's going to be pretty straightforward. You just have to be aware of the order in which these apps are being loaded. And that's part of the reason why we haven't done it until now, is we really wanted to settle on a solution that we're highly confident won't be a problem. And I think we found that. This is primarily led by my fellow maintainer, Jonathan Senecal, who's, I think, hit the nail on the head with a rather simple solution that allows us to do this. So you're essentially just going to define a list of apps to install, and if they need to be loaded after your plugin for whatever reason, just because of the intricacies of how different apps interact, then you can do that as well by specifying your plugin name first and then the models after. So again, if you're a plugin author, check that out. Let us know what you think. And some additional improvements here in that the cloning mixin has been that provides the clone method for duplicating objects in the UI. That's been spun off into a separate mixin class to be consistent with everything else. And generic views now have the ability to generate a query set dynamically based on the incoming request. So if you're familiar with like how the API view sets work, they have a method called getQuerySet that takes the request. So now, in addition to just defining a base query set attribute on view classes, you also have the option of defining a method if you need to, for whatever reason, modify the query set based on request parameters. So that's quite a lot, and I haven't even touched on everything that's coming out yet. There's a bunch more stuff, obviously, both planned and completed already for NetBox version 3.4. Those are some of the bigger points that I'm certain will be delivered. We have a couple more that people are working on that I didn't include on the slides. Things like virtual device contexts, being able to apply complex lookups like the filters in the UI, things like that. Primarily just because I don't want to overpromise. We're still hoping to get that in for 3.4 and have our first beta release out in mid-November. So I'm targeting around November 16th, probably middle of the week of the 14th for our first beta release. And then that, of course, following our schedule will mean a final release of 3.4.0 sometime in mid-December. Try to get that out well before the holidays so that we can all get our NetBox upgraded and then go on vacation in peace. All right, with that, I'll go on to the community Q&A portion. First question here is from Tom. It says, I would like to make a NetBox plugin, but have limited Python experience. What's the best way to get started? So this comes up a lot. People say, NetBox plugins look great, but I don't know much about like programming or Python in general. How do I go about learning that? It's obviously a kind of loaded question, but I'll throw up some resources here that I tend to point to people to all the time. So the first one is just for general Python knowledge. The site realpython.com has been amazing. I come across its content a lot, even just myself searching for random bits and pieces. But they have a ton of content. A lot of it is free. They do have a paid subscription model as well, which I think focuses more on like sample projects and community involvement stuff. But as far as like a lot of the written content is free. You'll find it, no doubt, just Googling various things about Python. And they have a very high quality of writing. So it should be really easy to pick up. If you prefer books, I'm happy to recommend No Starch Press for pretty much anything, not just Python. They have a very, very high quality they have very high quality content, and unlike most publishers, they will actually give you copies of their ebook in various formats without DRM. So it's very easy to get loaded on a Kindle or an iPad or whatever you have to read offline. That's great for Python in general. If you're looking at Django specific, there's of course the official tutorial from the official Django documentation. It's got I think 4 or 5 or maybe 6 steps now. That kind of walks you through building a base Django application, much like our plugins tutorial does, which I'll talk about in a second. You don't strictly need that to build a NetBox tutorial. However, it will provide a lot of context around why NetBox does things in a certain way. For example, why is there a models.py and a views.py within each app? And this it'll explain and exemplify Django's model view template strategy and how everything's basically, you've got a model that represents the database, you've got a view that represents the business logic, and then you've got a template that is used for the UI rendering. And I think it might actually get into a little bit of API stuff, but it might not, because those are actually handled by third-party packages. In addition to that, there's an excellent book called Two Scoops of Django, which focuses a little bit more on like advanced Django development. You can find more information about that on feldroy.com. I think they have a second Django book as well, though I don't remember the focus of it. But that's if you've become really familiar with like the basics of Django through the documentation and through the official tutorial, that's a great next step because it kind of talks about a lot more kind of like real world things and implications of Django development. And then finally, for NetBox specifically, of course, there's always the official plugin tutorial that was launched in conjunction with NetBox 3.2 earlier this year. And as you may have guessed from what we talked about earlier, we'll definitely have to expand that now to incorporate things like embedded views, embedded tabs, and search indexing and things of that nature. So keep an eye out for changes coming on that front as well. Hopefully that answers the question to some degree. Obviously, it's kind of a lot to say. How do I make a plugin? But again, if you need help, there's always GitHub discussions. There's our community Slack on netdev.chat. People are always around to help out. And in fact, there's a specific channel on the Slack called NetBox Plugin Development. So I know some plugin authors hang out there. Next up, what's the best way to request new features in NetBox? This is a question from Jeff on Slack. Actually, I thought it was a good one to cover on the call. It depends on how well defined your feature request is. So basically, before you do anything, you want to decide how detailed am I ready to be, right? If it's a simple request, something like, it'd be cool to add a mounting depth field to the rack model, which I just got done doing for 3.4. That's pretty straightforward, right? But even that has some discussion around it. But you can start that with saying, I want to add this is what I want to model, right? This is the depth between the front and the rear rails. And I want to add it to the rack model. Can we do that? And then there's some discussion that follows from that. That's reasonably simple. Anyone who picks it up says, oh, okay, I see what you want to do. And then there's questions like, oh, well, what unit should we store it in? Things like that were very, very detailed. You're really getting down into the nitty gritty of the implementation. That's fine to start with just a feature request. A lot of times people, though, don't really have a well-formed idea of what they want to do. They're saying something like, I want to be able to model like contracts in NetBox. What's a contract, right? That's obviously that you have to describe, what it is that you want to do. All the time we get feature requests that start with, it would be nice to do X. And like, that's the entirety of the feature request. So obviously that needs more discussion. That people are going to have questions, right? Get ahead of that, right? Don't just throw it out there because no one's going to get interested in it, right? If you're not giving people enough detail to think about it and realize what you want to do, then they're not going to latch onto it. They're not going to get interested in it, right? So put enough detail in there. And if you find that you don't know the answers to a lot of these questions, like it's still just kind of some idea that you have in your head that's not well formed yet, start a discussion instead. Drop it in a GitHub discussion because those are far less structured, right? If something pops into GitHub as an issue, the way the NetBox project works, and I realize not all open source projects are like this, but the way NetBox works, because we deal with such a high volume, is every issue represents essentially work to be done, right? It's like opening a Jira ticket if you use Jira. It's essentially something that needs to get done, needs to get moved through the queue, right? It's not just for discussion. It's saying this is what needs to be done, or this is what has been proposed to be done, and can be discussed in the terms of work to be done. And we can say, well, we can't do that because of X, or yes, we should do that, but after Y, whatever. But if it's just a discussion, we don't really know what it is that we're doing yet, then that belongs in well, as aptly named, discussions, right? Instead of as an issue. So check that out first. If you feel like you need more input, or just want to get like a kind of a litmus test from the community to say, hey, is this interesting to other people, or is it just me? And that might inform your decision as well, because if there's a lot of interest, it probably it might make sense to do as a core feature. Whereas if there's not much interest, it might make more sense as a plugin. So that's some consideration as well. Again, it all depends on what you're doing. But hopefully that provides a little bit of context around it. There's another question that came in from chat. Back to predefined filters, could we also edit/set the default view filter? There was another feature request that dealt with that specifically. I think it was applying a default filter, and the item or the detail that I got hung up on is how do you clear the default filter? More of it just strictly from a usability, like UX workflow perspective, very tactical. Maybe, but again, as I mentioned too earlier for Patrick, we'll introduce saved filters, and then we'll have people evaluate how they want to use them throughout the beta, and let us know. I mean, that's something to do, to discuss during the beta for sure. I mean, feel free to comment on the issue too, whatever FR it was. You can find it if you go to GitHub on the NetBox project and just search for, go to the issues list and apply milestone 3.4, and then be sure to check open and closed, because closed issues will have already been implemented. You can comment on there too and just say, hey, what about, can we apply a default? And that's something to consider as well. But definitely bring it up during the beta period. And then, like I said, during the beta period, we have carte blanche to change anything. It's very, very easy to change things. Once we hit that 3.4.0 release, a lot more difficult, just because we have to adhere to not introducing breaking changes to any of the APIs after a release. But yeah, we can probably figure something out. Again, this is just kind of exploring the usability and how people actually want to use these new features. There's another question from Hazen. Has any progress or thought been given to FR 10.500 for nested modules? I've not personally done anything there. I don't know. I don't know if the other maintainers have or not. I know the idea of nested modules came out back when we introduced it in, I want to say 3.0 or 3.1. I don't remember when we did modules now, but we opted not to for some reason, and I couldn't tell you what it was now. I don't know if it was just the additional complexity needed, or if it just wasn't identified in the use case, or what. But I can tell you no progress has been made on it for 3.4. That's not to say we won't do it in the future. It just hasn't been a focus of discussion as of late, given that we've focused on so much else going on, especially with the 3.4 release coming up. But yeah, I don't know if you're interested. If you're on the call and you're interested, go check it out, and I don't know, let us know what you think. All right, I think that is it that we have for this call. About half an hour in. Look at that. Thanks everyone for joining. Again, we do these calls monthly, so we'll have another one here in late toward the end of November. Should be after the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday, where hopefully we'll announce how the 3.4 beta is going and get some more feedback from people and see where we stand with that. And once I do release the 3.4, I'll, as I've been doing, I'll do a series of short videos that just kind of highlight each feature. So we'll talk about the global search and some of the plugins enhancements and things like that. So keep an eye out for those as well. That said, that's all we have for this month, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for joining.